Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. This week is week 4, climate change and education. Kai is the lead who has taken on a bulk of the readings. I'm going to fill in the ones that she um, wasn't able to do. As well, there are quite a few supplemental resources in this week, and many of those are really great resources. So if this is a particular area of interest for you, or if you're writing a paper for this course on um, how the education system can address climate change, then please see that. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is what is climate change education, and this paper is by some researchers in Australia. It's actually the supervisor for my PhD, Bob Stevenson, along with my colleague Jen Nichols, who I worked through my PhD alongside her. And in many ways I was inspired by the work she did in northern Queensland and realized that that same work hadn't been done here, and so I very much have been modeling my postdoctoral research off of the amazing work that she did in Northern Australia. And then another Faculty of Education professor there, Hilary Whitehouse. So what is climate change education? And the authors argue that climate change is not just a scientific phenomenon. It is a complex socio-scientific issue that demands more than teaching of content. Nichols' thesis found that among Queensland teachers who participated in her study, they viewed climate change in narrow ways. Learning the simplified basics of the complex climate system is only part of climate education. McCohen and Hopkins, who the article cites, and that's Charles Hopkins, who's the UNESCO Chair for Reorienting Education Worldwide. They write, climate change education is comprising two parts, climate and change. And I find this really helpful to sort of provide as a framework. So climate, they explain, involves the natural sciences, while change, or educating for change, involves engaging the social sciences and humanities. So if we only are teaching climate change through a scientific lens, then we are missing a lot of the pieces that address the social impacts, how to take action, how to communicate effectively around this complex issue, the environmental psychology aspect. And so that's problematic, and we'll talk about that more, but I find that framework very helpful in terms of climate and then educating for change. So persisting with a traditional content delivery or business as usual approach is increasingly seen as inadequate. So preparing students for futures that are unknown or only partially understood is one of the challenges for curriculum. The very complexity of the problem and the uncertainty of ways of responding means it is best addressed through curricular and pedagogies that fully allow students to explore the nature of the problem, discuss and debate appropriate pathways forward, and take positive actions. So the authors argue for inquiry and as well as co-learning. So letting the teacher feel confident to say, you know what, I'm not the expert on this, and that's a good question. Why don't we figure this out? And especially within climate change, the data changes quite quickly. And like we found out, the Climate Paris Agreement required a 2-degree threshold of warming, and then we had to switch to 1.5 degrees as the ceiling. So these turns happen, and we need to become okay as educators to navigating those shifts and also saying, wow, this is complex. How can we figure this out? Recently, I was very much interested in a program that some UBC students had created for high school youth in Vancouver, and this program was really around holding space for the anxieties and the emotions that high school youth have, and finding a way to facilitate that sharing, and then to move through that to then talk about actions. And they look at actions in the community, their local community, and addressing what they can do. And a lot of the environmental psychology literature talks about how action is the antidote to apathy. Greta Thunberg talks about, I don't want you to give me hope, but I want but through taking action, one may find hope. So I think that that's a very important tension there, and it's one that I'm constantly grappling with, and I know many educators are constantly grappling with in terms of how do we, as adults, knowing the moral obligation we have to students, also knowing the psychological fallout that happens when we learn about the level of degradation and the potential collapse of our society. How do we facilitate that conversation? And it's complex. So, and these aren't necessarily skills that, as educators, we're trained in explicitly. As well as in Scandinavia, there are some programs that have popped up very recently that are addressing this sort of holistic approach and address the emotional dimensions around coming to understand what climate change means. The next article, Americans Support Teaching Children About Global Warming. And this is an article from the Yale Climate Change Project, which shows that Americans overwhelmingly support teaching our children about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming. And I put this article in here just because we often think about how polarized the US is on climate change, and that's because of the vested interests of a few very powerful lobby groups who are able to sway the public opinion. However, I found this very interesting. This coupled along with the other research headline, which you may have seen, which is about 2 weeks ago, around how young girls are very effective at shifting conservative fathers' points of view on climate change. And so schools have an important role in how we address climate change education. The last article, Policy Coherence in Climate Change and Education Policy, a National Overview. This article analyzes the depth of engagement with climate change education policy across all 13 provinces and territories. And so what they did is a comparative content analysis, and basically they took what ministries of environment are arguing needs to happen, and then they took what policy documents are coming out of ministries of education and compared them. And what they found is that 3 themes emerged. Generally, ministries of environment say education is critical to a coordinated response to climate change, and ministries of education seem to fall very short in terms of taking the leadership on climate change education. So the 3 themes emerged in this article is that there's shallow engagement with climate change within education policies. And where there is engagement, it tends to be a predominance of energy efficiency upgrades for schools as a foremost education sector objective, and policy gaps that show a lack of attention to many areas of climate education. So one of the things that I did in my research for my postdoc is first wanting to map curriculum expectations on climate change across Canada, and to really understand this policy gap, because I've looked at this paper for the last 2 years, so 2017 it came out, and they're not very explicit about what the education policy documents are that they reviewed. So some of it is like school board action plans and some of it is curriculum, but there's no delineation about what is what. And I think the paper still is very important in terms of addressing that there's these huge gaps in our education sector in Canada. However, they're not transparent about the curriculum or around the action plans. And so with my graduate assistant this past year, we mapped every single climate change expectation in Canada to see what grade it happens in, whether it's an elective, and how many times it's cited. And then we ranked it qualitatively to address level 1 is just knowledge and understanding, sort of information download. Level 2 is stepping up in terms of Bloom's taxonomy and engaging critically with it. Are they analyzing? Are they examining it? And then level 3 is around taking action. And the majority of the expectations fall, well, first, let me tell you subject-wise, in science, and then second to that is geography. So in geography, we started to have more of the social impacts conversation, so that's good. And in some instances, we also found that there were some interesting high school electives, like in New Brunswick, there's a law class that looks actually at climate litigation and ethics. But that's the one in Canada. Also, in the prairies, there were some interesting electives that were special topics on mining and climate change and sustainability, on agriculture and climate change. And these are electives. And the majority of the level 3 ranked expectations are occurring in grade 12 electives. So that means that students who aren't choosing those electives aren't necessarily getting that opportunity to take action on climate change, at least if the teachers are following the curriculum. Now, we know that teachers generally teach according to what they feel confident in. And with climate change being a transdisciplinary topic, there's multiple knowledge gaps that a teacher will hold. You can't be an expert, an ultimate expert in climate change. The social impacts are too diverse, and we can't necessarily hold all of that. So then what we have is a survey with over 4,000 respondents, and we have close to 1,500 teachers who have responded. And within that 1,500 teachers, we have a small group, which is our representative sample, which look according to demographic data, StatsCan data. And this group is not as engaged. So they're not as certain about the knowledge and understanding of climate change. The salience of it is less. They're less concerned about the issues. And then we have a large sample from our data of very concerned teachers who are highly knowledgeable, highly concerned about climate change impacts, and are addressing it in their teaching beyond where the curriculum necessarily outlines it to be. So seeing it pop up in phys ed, in drama, in music. And this is wonderful. However, there's very little money being put forward to help teachers be professionally trained and have professional development conversations about how to do this work best. And so when we have teachers who are interpreting complex policy and having off-the-cuff conversations with students without necessarily engaging in a full inquiry, that's concerning to me. And I think that have teachers have better resources and also have more access to professional development to be able to make sure that what they're doing it is pedagogically sound, but also in alignment with what we substantively know about climate change. So, and there's not a lot of funding being put forward to that. There's more funding being directed at youth. And that is good, but I also think that teachers are incredibly important for having these conversations with young people and having them in thoughtful ways. So, and that is really what I wanted to say, and sorry for the long-windedness. I've had a lot of public speaking this week and will continue to do so, but thanks for all your hard work, and I will get marking done as soon as I can. We're having a community groundswell here in Orillia of people talking about climate change and organizing, and I'm also committed to doing some of that work. So if you have questions, email me. I'm very happy to see what's happening, and I will post the questions for those 3 articles very soon.